Well, we'll try to chug through. Can you all see the slides?
Yeah.
Fantastic. All right. This is meant to be really informal tonight. We'll kind of talk about some basic record keeping things, and part of our SARE grant that we have is trying to develop some record keeping tools and some forms and that, and I'll kind of go through some of those. The good example of that we'll talk about later was the pocket calving and weaning book. And then next month, actually, we're going to add another topic. A colleague of mine, actually, he was on last month talking about repro, but Dr. Anderson, I talked to him this week, and he's going to join us back on to talk about the online and smartphone record keeping system that they have. Greg, I assume that is you that jumped on. We'll let Greg, I think.
Yes, it is on.
So you must have got the bull up then.
Doctor Who finally showed up here, made a cameo appearance and came up to the barn. Yes.
Great.
So they set to load.
Good deal. Well, we'll keep on trucking so that you can get that done. And so one of the things that we always talk about on the beef side and others is, we can only manage what we can measure. And that really fits a lot of different things from, if you think about hobby animals, pet animals, just kind of hit me the other day. The dog here went in for his annual checkup, and, they keep records for their rabies vaccines. They keep track on their weights to make sure they're not getting overweight, and that they are, to have us make changes in diet plans. They make sure they get their heartworm and all that. So regardless of this kind of stage of production we're in, records are really important for health management and preventative health care in livestock. Each of those are going to be a little different depending on the region where you're at. All of you that are up higher in the mountains and semi-arid areas typically are not going to deal with the internal parasites that we're going to deal with down here in the more hot, humid southeast areas. So make sure that you work with your veterinarians. It's particularly important now, as Greg and I were just talking the other day, starting last week, all antibiotics are going to be required to have a prescription now, even your LA 300s, LA 200s, etc. So as you begin thinking about having access to some of those, you're going to have a veterinarian to write that prescription. So usually that requires an annual visit with your veterinarian, and you just never know when you might need that vet to be able to write you a prescription for one of the antibiotics that you might need for summer pneumonia or foot rot or anything like that. From a breeder's perspective, records can be a valuable asset for genetic selection for improvement, which you all know, and keeping track of pedigrees and seeing which matings work best, but also sustainability. And when we think about sustainability, economics are always a key component of that, particularly on the production side. And as we begin thinking about records, don't forget to keep track of the financial aspects on the records as well. And sometimes those get lost a little bit. Most of us probably would rather spend time out with the animals rather than sitting down and looking at the ledgers and the books. But let's keep that in the back of our mind too, to see where we're at and try to keep things sustainable from a profit-wise perspective. I think, when I look at record systems in the beef industry has been one of those things that have been a little bit of a challenge. But the easier we can make them, the more adaptable they can become, and you can tailor them to the information that you want to collect. So a lot of times paper records are a good place to start. And the reason for that is you can just record what information you want. You can use a combination of paper records and computers or smartphones. And like I said, Dr. Anderson will be on next month. We're going to add that topic down here to discuss the stockant program. Greg is probably familiar with this as the old name, which was X10B, but it has been relicensed in a new name, and he's going to come on and show you how it can be used on the smartphone as well as on the computer. And actually, they're working on setting up communities. And the reason I wanted him to come on next month is Dr. Anderson said the community development would be free. And so they would develop a yak community for us. And then within that community, you'll get free access to the record keeping software. And then there will be some fees that will come maybe down the pipe later on, but he's going to explain that to us next month. But currently it's free, and currently the record keeping software that's based around the beef system model is free, and it's in there. So in the future, there may be opportunities to get some modifications for yak specific areas. But right now it's again based on beef animals. The other thing is it has to be easy to capture the information and then review it. And I think that's where the online or the computer-based reports are nice, because you can have a report written and it summarizes your records pretty quick and easy. But you can also do that with paper records and a little bit of time and going back through and doing some calculations on things. And I'll try to walk through some examples of that here in a little bit. I think we can learn from our other industries. Yaks are ruminants, and they are in the Bovidae family, and they're in the Bos genus. So when we think about them, maybe they're more like Bos taurus and Indicus than maybe some of us want to accept or believe, but they get the same diseases, and they can, certainly hybridize with beef cattle. So we look at beef cattle operations. This is from the USDA analysis, where they surveyed several farms across the US, and they broke them out here in this table and based on herd size. So relatively small herds, 1 to less than 50, 50 to less than 100, 100 to less than 200. Oh, sorry, got a little trigger happy there. And then 200 or more. And if you look here then at handwritten records, computers that are on the operation, computers that are off the operation, that would mean that they had a computer at their maybe work and they used it for their record systems. But herds that are less than 50, almost 80% of the beef operation kept some sort of records, and the handwritten records were the most common. So I think that's a good place to start. And that's the beauty of handwritten records, is it allows you that flexibility. What value do these records have in your operations? I think first and foremost is probably the pedigree and the breeding to reduce the chance of inbreeding and developing inbreeding suppression. Health prevention, when we think about those records that we talked about with our pets a while ago, but then also keeping track of issues. If a calf develops respiratory disease and summer pneumonia or something like that, we have tools and or ways that we can think about how effective a treatment was. And so a lot of times we'll look at the first treatment success rates on those drugs, and then second antibiotic administration, did that take care of it? So those diagnostic tools, if you will, when it comes to health records, are pretty valuable. Performance and production traits are something that I think we could improve upon, or at least what I've seen is something we can improve upon. Many of us maybe have been focused on a single trait. Maybe it's color, maybe it's size, or whatever it may be. But we can begin thinking about trying to identify the superior animals that both have the phenotype that you're after, and then also maybe excel in some of the production traits. And that can be production as far as having quick turnaround from when they calve to when they rebreed. It can be yearling weight or 2-year-old weight, whatever that might be. But don't think that you have to always have a quote unquote scale or a weight, because I'm going to show some examples on how we can use some basic calving records to help us along the way. Genetic disorders and other issues, I think, as we begin looking at the pedigrees and begin looking at the limited genetic pool that we have, genetic disorders are potentially going to start surfacing more. And it may be something as minimal as inbreeding depression, or it could be something more lethal. So there's the opportunity to see these increase as that genetic diversity and that genetic pool begins to shrink. And so we want to make sure that we keep an eye on that as we move forward. I like to say it's easiest to start with things that you can measure and record quickly. They don't have to be very complex. And as you think about some of these things, I'm going to ask you, as you look at them, which one of these traits down here is probably going to be the most expensive to collect information on. So keep that in the back of your mind, and then I'll ask that here in a minute. But as simple thing to keep track of is animal inventory. I know that sounds crazy, but particularly when we start breaking it down by age and sex, so that you can start thinking about planning for, if you're in a meat market side, how many animals are you going to have, and are you going to be short to based on the demand, and how many replacement heifers are you going to keep versus selling, how many cows do you need that are getting up in that 15 to 20 plus years of age that may need to be replaced. Animal ID, and this is very simple, but not all animals are being kept with a visual ID. Probably isn't as big of a deal if you're there all the time, but what happens if you're not there and somebody's got to come in and take care of the animals, and they've got to treat something and they can't tell, you know, Snowflake from Bessie and from you know, the bull calf that was treated yesterday, because they didn't know it was treated yesterday when you were there, and there's no tag in its ear. So those simple animal IDs are something to think about as we move forward. They can help you, especially when it comes to registrations. If you're registering with USYAX and IX, you're getting the tags. Can also help, like I said, with those treatments, particularly when you've got other farm hands that are coming in and taking care of the animals while you're gone. And then lastly, that production data to capture who's maybe excelling in performance, or maybe which ones are at that bottom 20% that probably shouldn't be considered for replacements. The pregnancy data is really valuable to know when they're calving and who's pregnant and who's not going to maybe calve this year. Keeping track of that sire information so that we minimize the potential of inbreeding by breeding daughters back to the same sire. Calving data. Again, calving data is a little bit different than pregnancy data. You might think of them as being the same, but they're really not. You know, pregnancy data is done after the breeding season. Calving data includes any potential abortions that would have occurred from the time that maybe we preg check to when calves are actually starting to be born. And that abortion loss is something that we want to keep track on, because you know, some of the lethal recessive traits due to inbreeding lead to these early embryonic death losses that will contribute to greater abortion losses. Calving intervals are something else that we can track using calving data, and we'll go through that example in a minute. But you know, if we look at a cow and she calved in 2019, when did she calve again in 2020? When did she calve again in 2021, 2022, et cetera? And is that gap widening, staying roughly the same, or did she pick up and maybe calve another 2 weeks earlier? And those things can be useful when we start thinking about troubleshooting what might have gone wrong. Simple things like coat pattern, colors, nose color patterns. It's useful in helping develop inheritance patterns and developing SNPs or SNP marker tests for genetic evaluations. I'll show a good example of that here in a minute, and with Dr. Peterson's paper where she looked at that KIT gene and then also the nose marking colors. Horn shape and curvature. We know, depending on the cattle integration, that there's differences in horn shape in beef cattle, and depending on what maybe cattle genes are there, that horn shape and curvature can certainly be different than what we would have expected to see from maybe Bos Mutis as the original kind of foundation animals. And then herd health info is very easy to keep track of, particularly when you're vaccinating or deworming. Those are simple things to record on a herd basis. They don't have to even be individual basis. If you know you're vaccinating all the weanlings, you can just do a group record and put down, the spring calf crop was vaccinated for 5-way respiratory disease on June the 21st, and get that information recorded. So which of these do you think is the most expensive to likely get recorded? I would say it's probably your pregnancy data, right? Because most of us are going to require the veterinarian to come out there. Yep, that's exactly right, Trish. So I think pregnancy data, when we think about it from the vet's perspective, you've got a field visit or a farm visit plus their time. And so that is probably the most expensive one, particularly on smaller operations, because usually there's a set farm visit fee. But if you remember in our early discussions about the need to maintain that vet client patient relationship, if you can tie that annual visit into your pregnancy data, then you're really minimizing that investment, because now you've solidified that vet client patient relationship, and you've established that kind of understanding and knowledge of the herd. And so when you call into the vet office and you need some Draxxin or you need an antibiotic, they know the operation and they're willing to write that prescription. So there can be some definite benefits to having that relationship, and maybe it's not as costly as you think. Today, we've got some new technologies for pregnancy diagnosis. From what I've seen and heard from others, we've not used it yet, but the bioprine blood test does seem to work for pregnancy testing. It has been developed for both beef cattle and bison, and based on what I've seen on Christy Novak's Facebook page, as well as others that have posted on there, the bioprine system does work. Now at Greg's, we've tried the IDEX alerts system, which is a system that requires about 10 minutes shoot side to develop. It's an ELISA test, which is really nice because it's quick and easy. We had it work one in an animal that was about 60 to 90 days pregnant, but when we tried it in animals that were 4 weeks and under, we didn't seem to get positive responses out of that. So we're going to go back and test a little bit more on those to see if those alert systems work for yaks, and then we'll update you all on that, because that cost is about I'm gonna say they're about $10 a test. And the nice thing is you can order a package of those and keep them on hand, and as you bring cows through, you can pull those blood samples and do the preg checks and get an idea if a cow's open or not. That's a little different than the bioprine and others, where you have to collect your blood samples and then you ship your blood samples overnight to their lab, and then they'll run them and get you the results back. So pocket calving books, I mentioned this a while ago, but if you don't have a small calving / weaning book, just shoot me an email. We've got those, and I'd be happy to send you a pocket book, and that'll help you just start keeping something in the truck or in your UTV or in your pocket as you go out there and check on cows and see who's calved, and you can begin recording those basic notes. All right, so how can we use some of these records to kind of look at our systems? I've got 2 cows here. I'm giving you some calving records and maybe give you a little bit of insight of what's going on to start thinking about. So what do you see in these basic calving records? Obviously, cow 1 had 5 calves, cow 2 had 6 calves, but does it tell you which one is older? So what do you feel free to unmute, but look at that information, and what do you see looking at those 2 cows?
Cow 1's older.
Cow 1 is older. Why do you say that, Bob?
Because she's getting later and later in her getting pregnant, and the other one is actually getting earlier.
Okay, that's good. Is there any way to actually know it for sure?
No.
No. Nope. But that's one thing. I mean, the suspicion is, and I think you're right on the money, is that cow 1 would be older. And so now what I've tried to do is to try to compare them. So I've taken the 2 cows and I've blocked them across years on when they would calve. So you've got 18, you've got 19. And then I've calculated your calving interval. So that's essentially the days between when she calved. So echoing what Bob just said, as you look at this cow, she's starting to stretch out some, or she's more inconsistent in her calving interval than maybe what this cow has had. There's been 1 year here where she didn't calve though. And so when you start looking at these 2 cows, which one would you potentially call if you had to?
Neither.
Cow 1, cow 2, neither. Going to keep them both. That's a possibility. Because they're going to be on the farm until they die, maybe. But let's think about it then a different way. Which one would you maybe keep heifers out of?
2.
Out of 2. Trish said she's got to keep them both. She can't call any. Exactly. Nothing wrong with that. So I don't know that there's enough information here to determine which one you may want to keep heifers on. But if you're looking at fertility as an indication, I would say that keeping heifers out of cow 2 may be your better bet, because again, she's most consistent in keeping a 365-day calving interval or less, though she's not really done it but 2 years. Now, what else can you see in this information if you really look at it close? What happened in this breeding season here that caused this cow to drop 100 days and for this cow to not even get bred and have a calf? It's possible that it had nothing to do with the females at all, and that it was an issue with a bull, and that a bull was going sterile or going bad and couldn't cover all the cows. And this happens in the beef side more often than you would think. And sometimes we want to always point the finger to the females, but realize that if we're not doing breeding soundness exams on the bulls, which can be done, if they can do a breeding soundness exam on a beef bull, your veterinarian can do it on a yak and determine if there's the number of normal sperm, motile sperm, et cetera, to make sure that those bulls are not subfertile and actually cause this type of lag simply due to them not being fertile and causing this issue to happen. So that's another way that we can use some of these basic things that don't require any weights, don't require anything other than keeping information on when a cow's having calves. All right, I got a little more data and I'm going to give you a little more time to look at it. But, you know, when we start thinking about calving intervals, I've got 25 cows listed over here. We can begin looking for trends. And so in this herd, the first calf was born on March the 1st and the last one on September the 2nd. Calving season then, if we look at from that time interval from the last calf to the first calf, was about 185 days. Do you like what you see in the calving season here?
No.
Why not?
Well, it's a hard time for the calves and the moms due to heat and flies and things like that.
Particularly down here in our area, right, Greg?
Yeah.
But Bob and the rest of you, with this calving interval, calving season, this June, July, August, would this catch a lot of your calves when they're born?
They catch a lot of my calves. Yeah.
Yep. So if we go back then, and if we make the assumption that the gestation length is about 255 days in a yak, then this column represents the expected breeding date for each of those. And so then we can begin looking at when maybe most of these cows got bred. And so this also relates back to Greg's comment. There's not maybe that many that got bred in that June, July window. And it could simply be due to heat stress. And Dr. Prater will share some information at our October conference down here at Moorhead on what they've learned about fertility of bulls as we go through the calendar year and the impacts of heat stress down here on fertility. But it certainly is showing that these bulls do suffer some. And so this period, particularly Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, it's going to certainly be more conducive to cooler weather, greater activity, probably greater estrus signs. And so it does make a little bit of sense then that we've gotten away from heat stress. It takes about 60 days for a sperm cell to mature. And so if we go back and we start thinking about this, then that would say that in August, some of these sperm cells are being developed. And that's the time window, maybe when it's beginning to cool down up there in your areas. And particularly when you're up there at 10, 11,000 feet, you're going to be much cooler. And so that makes sense as to why you might see more of these beginning to come in this June, July, August window. So again, it's just a way to start looking at that and begin thinking about what maybe this calving data can help you kind of troubleshoot. There's the big break. I just wanted to highlight this big break right here. There's really not a lot that went on before September. And these could just simply be cows that have actually were developed at a different time and they were heifers and they started calving early, or I mean, not really sure what's going on with that herd. If I took that information and we think about the estrus cycle being about 21 days and we began to group them into 21-day groupings, in our normal kind of beef herd situation, what we like to see is typically 65% of the calves born in the first 21 days. That's what we really like to see. So maybe in yaks, ideally, what we would want to see is about 50 to 65% born in the first 21 days. If you look at this example herd, there were only 8% in the first 21 days, 16% in the first 43 days. If you add these two together, you get 16%. You hit that kind of break there in that late July and August where you didn't have anything. And then you start pushing out in that June, July, August window, and that's when the majority of the calves are being born. So I think one thing is Dr. Anderson, just to follow up on his presentation last month, the issue here is that the bulls weren't separated. And so if cows aren't getting pregnant early, then they're going to cycle and maybe they're not settling, but maybe you're just putting a Band-Aid on some subfertility. And so that's where going back then and looking at that calving interval to make sure that they're not slipping, as Bob said that one cow was doing. Maybe she's just getting older. Maybe there's malnutrition going on. As they get older, their teeth begin to get worn and they can't consume as much forage. So there can be some things that are going on. We also know that as ruminants get older, their ability to absorb nutrients out of the gastrointestinal tract gets reduced, so they become harder keepers with age. Is there anything going on with an environmental stress, either a drought situation that reduced forage availability or heat stress? All of those things can be kind of started to think and roll in the back of our mind when we start breaking out the information and looking at it this way. And then if you can tie that in the body condition scores, just like Dr. Anderson mentioned last month, the literature would really tend to indicate that fertility in cows, in the yak cows, is strongly driven by body condition and plane of nutrition. And so when we begin to see cows that start getting pretty thin, they tend to go an estrus, or they're not cycling back. So that anestrus, that time from when she calves to when she returns into that first heat after calving, gets lengthened. And so that anestrus period pushes her later and later and later if she's not got good body condition score. We could think about moving forward to collecting weights. This is particularly valuable in monitoring health, particularly young animals with all the hair. Sometimes it's hard to see through the hair, but a weight will give you an kind of an absolute value. Are they in a positive plane of nutrition? Are they putting weight on, or have they lost 20 pounds since the last time you weighed them and there may be something going on? Gives you the opportunity to properly dose for like internal parasites. That can be something that can affect us down here, maybe more than you all, but certainly can be a real challenge for us. And then helping you to identify those superior animals for replacements. And it doesn't have to be expensive. This is just an example of the system similar to what we're using at Greg's that we brought out to Denver. The actual load bars are, and the scale head is about $250. You can build a wooden platform. You can do a steel platform, whatever you want to do. But the actual load bars themselves don't have to be super expensive. I priced out a true test and Gallagher system the other day for an operation for an alleyway scale. And I think with one of the cheaper scale heads and like a 6,000 pound load bars, the cost on that system was about $3,000. So just to give you a comparison, and they can go up, from there up to 6,000-8,000 pretty quick. But these do tend to work, and they do tend to work pretty well. We've used them at Greg's now going on 3 years, and really haven't had to do anything but put new batteries in it. Bob knows this one, Greg knows this one, but for those of you that weren't on when I talked about records the last time, here's your pick a bull exercise. So you've got bulls 10 through 17 that you're looking, and you can type your answer in the chat, or you can unmute here in a minute and shout out your answer. But your goal is to find a growthy bull, a new bull, young bull to buy, and you really want to find one that's going to do well from a growth perspective to breed the cows in the future. You're going to buy the bull relatively young and developing until he gets mature. So you can train him and get him used to you and all that. So you're buying him around 14, 15, 16 months. And let's just assume that all these bulls are acceptable. They meet the phenotype that you want, and there's no structural issues and all that. So when you start looking at it, you start thinking about, well, what were their adjusted weaning weights? And you can kind of see that, all right, if we want weaning weight, maybe bull 15 was the best one. He was at 220 pounds. And then that growth continued out there for another 6 months. And he was the heaviest bull out here at a year of age. But if you really want to make this a little bit simpler, what we would do is we would use ratios. And so ratios are simply finding the mean or the average for the group and then dividing the individual by the average. And the ratios are really only valid for within herds or within a specific group on your farm. And I say specific group because sometimes you might be looking at fall calving versus spring calving. And if you've got that 185-day calving interval, you don't want to compare that really old calf to that really young calf. You want to break those down to probably no more than about 100 to 120 days. And so you'd have to break them into two kind of age groups. But by doing the ratios, then we can start eliminating some of these bulls really quickly. And I put scrotal circumference in here as well, because, you know, we know there's a strong correlation between scrotal size and the ability to breed cows. The more testicular size a bull has, the more opportunity he has to develop more sperm cells, which means his serving capacity or the number of cows he can breed is going to be greater. So if we start looking at this too, we can start peeling some of them out, because this one here with the really small scrotal circumference and only at 79%, that's pretty low. I mean, that's 20% below the average. So there may be something wrong with that one. So we throw him out, even though he was the growthiest potential bull. If he's going to be subfertile, maybe we don't want him. We start throwing out some of these lower growthy, you know, less than 100 on yearling weights, less than 100 on weaning weights. And we start knocking these out because they don't meet our growth characteristics. Where does that leave us then? Well, that really leaves us then with bull number 11. And sure, he's just slightly better than average in weaning weight, and he's, you know, probably the third highest. Actually, he's the second growthiest bull out to yearling weight, and he's 106 on his scrotal. So not a huge curve bender, but better than the average. And so we would expect this bull to give us better than average type growth based on the numbers here. But one of the limitations is that it's within your own herd or within your own group. And that's where breeding values and EPDs are kind of superior, because they take into account the different environments that the bulls and calves are raised in. But an example of why these ratios are important is, let's say that you went to Super Yak Ranch and you came down to buy a bull from me, and the bull that you looked at found that he ratioed 125% on yearling weight. And you're like, yeah, that's the bull I want, because 125%, he's the best one out there. But then you look at his actual weight at a year of age, and it was 385 pounds. And you've got this bull back home that was at 413 pounds, but only ratioed 108. So that's the limit on ratios. And so sometimes even the highest ratioing bull in another farm may not offer you an advantage, I guess is the way to think about that. And the only way to overcome that is to move into breeding values or EPDs. All right, can we combine science with records? So some of you are probably familiar with Dr. Peterson's work when she developed the SNP test, and you guys are getting that on your pedigree SNP data that you get back. And so the KIT gene is the solid or the piebald or royal color pattern. So as you read through her paper, which I don't expect a lot of you have, but as I read through it, if you look at the black or the solid sided pattern, there was kind of a variant or a mutation in the SNP area that was this methionine 195 variant, and there had to be two copies. So, you know, a copy from the dam and a copy from the sire of this variant from normal that leads to this kind of what they call solid pattern, or which would be your native pattern. Then a trim actually kind of had basically this normal copy or more high. It was prevalent at a higher rate, if you will. And then this variant. So it had a heterozygote to get a trim. And then for the royal, it was homozygous here for plus plus. So when you get your SNP test back, these are basically what they're looking at, is they're looking for the alleles for these color patterns. And when they say that they're a trim, then you know that they're a heterozygote. If they say that they're a solid, then you know they're a homozygote with this. And if they're a royal, they're a homozygote with these alleles. In their paper, they also looked at the MC1R gene in beef cattle and other species. We also know that this is the gene that controls red and black. And so in the MC1R gene, there's 4 kind of different variants. Actually, I think there's 6 variants if we throw the gray and that in there. But in coat color in cattle, this is a major color influencer. And so this is what they found using it with your nose color. For imperials, they either have these as a homozygote on these 3 alleles, or they're heterozygote. And then native, they're homozygote, but they're carrying the exact opposite. So when we think about this, we can begin asking, can we use it to predict or determine what kind of color patterns there might be? So this is just a quick down and dirty, maybe can we actually use this information to unravel some things that we maybe don't know, combined with records, and records can include photographs. So this is a bull who DNA typed as a trim. And when he was bred to a native, he gave a native. When he was bred to a golden royal, he gave a golden royal. When he was bred to a regular royal, he gave a trim. When he was bred to an imperial, he gave an imperial. And I'm not making this up. This is actually in the registry. And so if you look at the DNA information, the kit information, he was a trim, but he gave a solid, he gave a solid, and he gave a trim, and he gave a royal. So he gave all 3 potential patterns. How's that happen? So if we start with one, and what I've done is I brought Jessica's paper information in up here to keep track of this for you. So here's our nose colors. So for an imperial versus a native, and then this is our royal versus solids. So he was a DNA trim, which means he would be a heterozygote here. So to get a solid, you've got to have homozygote with the MET 195 variant. And the dam was a solid, so she carries 2 copies, so she passes 1 copy, and he would have to pass 1 copy. And so that's how you get the solid native color pattern. Then if we think about, is he a native or an imperial for nose color? To be native, they've got to be homozygote, right? And so she's going to pass a T, a G, and an A along to this calf. So she passes 1 copy, 1 copy, 1 copy. So that means that he has to provide 1, 1, and 1. So now the question is he a native or an imperial? And we just can't tell that yet, right? Because he could have passed the T on from here, could have passed the G on from here, and he could have passed the A on for here. Or he could be a native and he passed this on, this on, and this on. What about if we did the royal? So in order to get the trim, so a royal has got to be plus plus. So she passes the plus on. And so then that means that he's going to pass on this one in order to get that trim color pattern. But then he's kind of got that royal nose, right? And so that would be a T, a T, a G, a G, an A, and an A. And so we've got to kind of sit back and say, well, we're really not sure. But this probably then eliminates this homozygote potential, right? It probably eliminates this because they've got to pass a T, a G, and an A. So what about if we bred him to an imperial? And so an imperial is going to be solid color pattern. So and he threw an imperial calf. So this comes in from him and she throws in one from there. And so you get that solid color pattern. And so then you get the imperial nose, which can be either the homozygote or the heterozygote this way. So we really maybe haven't fully answered what he is, but probably there's a good chance that he's this in order to get those native color noses. And then lastly, I didn't throw this in, but in his progeny registration, he also will throw whites. And so when he was bred to a white cow that did not have a DNA test, he also produced a calf that tested as a white trim. And so we don't know exactly. What we know is very little about her because there's no DNA, but she's probably just like he is because one of them's got to pass a plus and one of them's got to pass the variant. And so that's how you can begin using this kind of information along with other information to begin developing your SNP tests. So are there issues with inbreeding? Believe it or not, I went back and I found the original Alaska work that was done, the Canadian work in that up in Alaska. And the females at the time when they did this work, they bought them in like 1919, I think is when they brought them in from Canada. And the females were weighing 7. These were straight yaks, which they were hybridizing with beef animals. But the yak females were listed in the report to weigh 700 to 900 pounds. So that gives us an idea that there's probably been some inbreeding depression and causing our females maybe to get smaller. In the Chinese literature, they report the same problem. And this was one of the reasons that spurred the development of the Datong yak that I had the fortune to go to the research center there and tour. And that Datong yak is basically a Bos mutus by Bos Grunyon's cross. And so Bos mutus is much bigger. And so they're developing these animals that are much growthier and larger in size, and then sending those out to the herds to try and improve growth. Reproductive issues, they're difficult to see because they're usually pretty subtle. But this delayed time to hit puberty, this reduced fertility, increased embryonic death loss, so that maybe they bred and then you didn't see them return in that heat, but then they wind up coming back in the heat later on, or they stretch out to that instead of calving at 360 to 380 days, they're stretching out to 400 to 450 days, maybe because they've got early embryonic death loss and then they've got to go back and recycle. And then any genetic defects that might be there. And we talked a little bit about some of those, but you know, having an extra appendage that might be growing off. So a leg coming off of a shoulder or a leg coming off of the neck. There's even been instances where a leg's growing out the head, spina bifida and some of those issues. But we got to be careful because sometimes those can be health related too. So let's talk about records. Records can be whatever you want them to be. They can be as complex and that is they collect everything under the moon, or they can be just simple things that you can start. This is a sheet that I developed as part of our grant that I'm happy to send to anybody that wants it. It's an Excel sheet, but it's modeled after kind of thinking about our yak production systems, and this would be for a calf crop. And so we would start with the calf and record the dam information. And so here's your information on the dam registry. If it had a different name, you know, sometimes we name them as different things rather than numbers, whatever that might be. You can put all that kind of flexibility in there. But when you think about records, I guess I'd open it up to have some quick discussion about what form of records would you use, paper, electronic, both? What information would you think about collecting? How would you spend the time to review them? I mean, do you need consultation to actually say, all right, what does it all mean? How can I tease some of that out? How do I do the ratios? How do I calculate calving interval? And I think at some point in time, the registry or association probably needs to start thinking about requiring some of this to begin teasing out whether or not you're suffering from any inbreeding depression, or whether or not you've got some potential concerns to just kind of think about as you move forward. And that's never easy, because that means what happens if I only submit the information on the best animals and not the whole herd? What value is that information? And in the beef industry, we went through that, and now nearly all the beef associations require whole herd reporting. And so that doesn't mean that you're collecting yearling weights on every animal, because that doesn't happen. A lot of them are sold at weaning time, but it does mean that you got to report your calving information on everything. So that's one of the things that is required. Calving and weaning is usually the two things that they want to know. So with that, I'm going to open it up and let you all kind of share with me your thoughts on records and what you would use and what would be important.